Well, good afternoon again, everyone. This is Derek Edwards from AGS. I know we still seem to have a handful of people coming in. Darlene, are you on the call? Can you hear me? Do you have a microphone?
Yeah, I'm here.
Wonderful.
Welcome. Glad you're with us. And
It's
thank you
lovely
for
to
doing
meet
this
you.
for the Academy.
Absolutely. My pleasure to have somebody to have listen to me talk for an hour and a half.
Yeah, I like that. I wish I had somebody every day anymore.
Well, maybe we should just have a morning coffee clutch. Mondays you talk, Tuesdays I'll talk, Wednesdays, switch back and forth.
Yeah, well, since the virus has gotten so bad here in Florida, this morning's statistics, if I go to a gathering of 10 or more people, I'm 52% likely to get the virus. If there's more than 50, I'm 87% likely to get the virus, even with a mask on. So I think you have just about everybody in the room, so I think you could get going.
Okay. Well, then that is exactly what we'll do. So for those of you just joining us, thank you for joining us here this afternoon. My name is Derek Edwards. I'm the President and Chief Technical Officer for AGS Data Systems. We have worked for a number of years in the employment training, employment security, economic development realm with providing systems to organizations to manage information, to do big data analytics, to do data analysis and reporting and visualization. And Darlene has been kind enough to ask me to come and talk about a few of my favorite topics in terms of technology, the future of technology, and what I hope will be an interesting, very high level presentation and conversation about what is broadly referred to as this fourth industrial and the impending fifth industrial revolution that we face as a modern society. What that means and how that can affect curriculum development, schools, the career pathways that you're training for, and put a few tools in your hand, both in terms of how to think about these topics and some preliminary suggestions on how to look at quantifying the impacts of these technologies so that you can consider them as a part of your curricula development process. Darlene, any other introductory comments that you want to make for the group as a whole?
No, I think you did just fine. Thanks. I do really appreciate you doing this for us. And I do think, we did meet with Josh Davies a few weeks ago to talk about workforce skills of the future. And now it's going to be great to talk about this in the context of curriculum. So thanks for doing this. And I'm handing it all back to you.
Good. Well, thank you. A pleasure to be here. And, it's interesting. Josh and I have very, I won't say different. We have, very, very separate areas of interest and outlook. And so I think it's probably highly complementary. I'd like to think it's highly complementary to get to hear these two approaches. I think from the community college perspective, whether you like the change that's coming, you don't like the change that's coming, I will assert that a tremendous amount of change is coming. It will impact community colleges more than society as a whole. And I see every reason to be looking forward to, if not the new golden age, because I'm not sure what the previous golden age for community education, community colleges would have been, the 2-year systems, but I think we are looking forward to a vital, vigorous golden age where the 2-year systems are in exactly the right spot to be the educational medium of choice, not only for a new generation of individuals that need this kind of training and upskilling. And there are some downsides to the way demographics are going to change. There are some tremendous upsides to the way demographics are going to change. But I think that a tremendous amount of what we currently see being processed through the 4-year structure is going to begin reverting to the 2-year structure. And I will say right up front, entirely from a STEM environment perspective. I am a technologist. I am a software developer. I have a background in artificial intelligence and big data analytics and machine learning. So it is entirely possible that someone speaking in this same vein about liberal arts educations, about biology, about theater arts, would have a very different perspective. And I don't pretend to be an expert in any of those areas, but this opinion is limited, I think, or certainly most germane to computer science, data science, physics, math, and the like. Just a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces here. We're not going to need the video today. So if you have your webcam turned on, you can turn that off. I am in fact going to turn mine off as well so that you can see the full screen for the presentation. This is, if you have a microphone, please make sure that that is muted. If you are on PBX of some sort, please do not use your hold button, but find a way to actually mute the phone so we don't have to listen to ABBA for another hour and a half while we're all here on the conversation. If you do want to have or take part in the conversation, unmute yourself, speak up, let me know that you have a question. I really would prefer to make this a good conversation, talking about particular topics of interest as they crop up, rather than an hour and a half presentation of running through my slides. I think they're informative, I think they're interesting, but I will only know if they are specifically germane to your environment if you give me some sort of feedback. So please do stop me at any time. Let's run off on a tangent and down a rabbit hole and talk about some of these pieces. More important that we have germane conversations than I get to the end of my set of slides. And then all of this presentation and other resources that I will reference while we're having this conversation are going to be available online. There are a few takeaways from today, and then I'll show you a URL you can write down in order to make sure that you can access the resources later. We want to talk about this fourth revolution, what people mean when they use that terminology in technology forecasting, and we want to talk about a few of the principal technologies and a little bit of terminology that goes along with this. I want to set a little bit of that framework, a little bit of that groundwork, and then talk about the impact that this will have on society and education, and then spend a little bit of time talking about how you can, in fact, quantify the potential likelihood that these technologies will impact your pathways. And then it will be up to you to decide how you want to react to that. One of the things that I think is fundamental about this to keep in mind is that specifically the technologies I want to talk about today do not represent more technology. They represent a fundamentally different shift. And that's a point I want to try to get across as we're talking about these. This is the URL. If you want to jot anything down, this agsprime.com/NCWE 2020 will take you to a page that will provide you with links to my PowerPoint presentation and the other resources that I'll be showing during the talk. Before we go any further with that, and I wander off into this part of the presentation, anyone have any questions? Is there anything in particular that anyone has come here today specifically hoping to get out of this presentation that you want to put on the table to make sure that I can do my best to get around to it? I will give that polite pause, and I will say that's a no. So the fourth industrial revolution. When you hear this term, so it's the fourth, what were the others? Very, very, very broadly speaking, We talk about the first industrial revolution in modern history as steam and mechanization, beginning, roughly speaking, of the 1800s. Historians will peg this somewhere around 1790 to about 1820, maybe as late as 1830. But there was a time when essentially everything was a métier. Everything was a cottage industry. Everything was done by hand. And if you wanted mass production, it meant you hired 25 times as many people to scale up to 25 times that level of production. Steam and mechanization fundamentally changed and kicked off what we at the broadest level refer to as the Industrial Revolution. Historians generally classify the second industrial revolution as the coming of widespread electrification and concepts and application of mass production, which, while were prototypable in steam-based environments, were really turned loose when electrification allowed mass production to be run at any location, regardless of access to water supply or the sheer bulk of machinery required in order to run the steam plants. The third, more recently, computerization and electronics, the microcircuit, modern computers as we understand them. And the fourth industrial revolution around automation and, in a very, very large way, artificial intelligence and machine learning. We are, reasonably speaking, right in the middle. I would call it the late early stages. We are at the end of the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. The fifth industrial revolution, which at this rate of progression will be sometime tomorrow or Thursday of next week, I would posit the major players there, as we look back on them 50 years from now, will broadly fall into the category of gene editing, as biology asserts itself as a first primary motivator in the Industrial Revolution, and quantum computing, which you've probably all heard the term. You may hear on a regular basis that such and such is making advances in quantum computing, but you're probably potentially at a loss to understand or to have at hand a very good example of how quantum computing has changed your life. Quantum computing is one of those things, like computers and electricity, that will change almost everything in the basic sciences. It will dramatically advance what we are doing in pharmaceuticals and material research and the like. There are a couple of things I want to draw your attention to in a few bullet items like this. One of those is 1800, 100 years to 1900, roughly speaking 75 years to the third, roughly speaking 65 years to the next, and gene editing coming along even faster than that. We are seeing not just waves of industrial revolutions, we are seeing these coming at an ever faster pace. Not only is there tremendous change, but there is a tremendously steep wave front in terms of rate of change. And if you are of a mind to read articles on futurism and machine intelligence and quantum computing and these kinds of topics draw your attention in the news, you will have seen reference to a term called singularity. There is, and it's widely and wildly open to interpretation, a concept looking at this and saying, well, if it was 100 years and then 75 and then 50 and then 10 and then 5, where are we going with that? You know, where are we gonna be able to get to? And the singularity posits that we are rapidly approaching a point where change and evolution will come so quickly that we will converge to a point beyond which it is impossible to predict the future It is impossible to extrapolate out, because the difference between now and 50 years from now is not the same as the difference between now and 50 years ago. It is the difference between now and 10 years from now is more like the difference between now and 100 years ago. And that rate of change cannot continue without becoming disruptive in and of itself. And that's one of the things, just one of the concepts I want you to hold in mind. You know, whether you believe this is imminent or it's just one of those things that people like to talk about, it's a concept that I'd like you to be listening to, listening for, and considering as we talk about some of these technologies. There is a lot of conversation about these technologies, and this is a sort of kind of the sort of topics that you hear all of the time. A lot of noise. Robots are going to take this. Automation is going to take that. It will take all of these jobs. It won't take all of these jobs. 50% of the economy is in danger of automation. 50% of the economy will be automated, and therefore we will all be living in a beautiful post-scarcity environment in the future. All of these tend to be very absolutist on one side or the other. And so that's also something we want to talk a little bit about. It is, as you can imagine, going to have many of the attributes of previous industrial revolutions. In the late 1800s, something like certainly by the early 1800s, something like 80% of the workforce in America were agrarian, producing crops and in farming. And if you had said to someone at the time, some economist looking at the future, in 100 or 150 years, we will have gone from 80% of the workforce being on the farm to about 3.5% of the workforce being related to growing our crops. And that would have made no sense at all, because the immediate question would have been, what will those people do? Because there was no way to understand, as the economy has grown, that there would be not just more jobs, but there would be that the vast majority of what people do would be in industries that had not even been imagined or written about at the time. And it's that compression, again, it's this compression that we're dealing with that keeps this from being just more of the same. We talk about robots and automation and AI of a lot of these topics. Those are the ones that you hear about the most. I want to offer a little bit of a definition to go along with some of those topics. Automation, when you hear people talking about the impact on jobs, they are generally talking about some sort of mechanical process that can perform a job with reduced or eliminated levels of human interaction. We have, of course, seen automation for hundreds of years, and we have all been, the ones on this call, in the workforce probably long enough to have seen a few very good examples. Some of us are old enough to remember when CNC machines first came into tool and die shops. And on the one hand, you would have said, well, that's the end of the career path for tool makers. And for those that cut and filed, yes, that was the case. But of course, it allowed for an explosive growth in the productivity and therefore the economic viability of that particular industry. And I dare say we have more CNC operators than we ever had hand tool and die makers, 60 or 70 years ago. There are some other examples. While automobiles are still done in a very painfully manual fashion on an assembly line, within that assembly process, think about the welding. I'm not sure that there is any welding operation in a modern automotive assembly line that is still managed by hand. Very, very little, if any, in some of those assembly lines. Robotic welders came along and were able to essentially eliminate human welders on those assembly lines. But that, of course, gave rise to the technicians required to service and maintain. There's always going to be this give and take. So anytime you look at the dire predictions, well, those are probably not appropriately made. There's always going to be that give and take. Robotics, as separate from automation. Robotics very frequently mean not just automation, but some sort of ability to manipulate and mobility. It's a broad definition, but I think when most of us consider robotics and we talk about robotic operations, robotic machines taking the place of humans, we're talking about things that physically get up and move around. And artificial intelligence, machine learning, they're not, for people that do either of those, they're very, very different things within the context of this conversation. You can scrape all of that kind of stuff together. It's basically saying that we have reached the point in the sophistication of the algorithms that we know how to write, especially in the realm of machine learning. That means we are now regularly building systems and deploying systems in the commercial world that have the ability to learn how to do a thing or to take over or augment a human's natural ability to do a thing, even if in the traditional sense of programming, we don't know how to describe it. For example, you may not know how to describe to an algorithm, pick a good stock. You may not know how to describe to an algorithm, watch all of the parts coming past you on this assembly line and point out any that are anomalous. That's a very, very difficult thing for us to explain in traditional computer science and programming terminology. But artificial intelligence and machine learning are branches of automation, the broader picture of automation, where, as I said, our algorithms have now reached a point that we can design systems and do incredibly widely distributed in commercial environments now. We are well past the early days of AI and machine learning, where these algorithms learn how to do by doing and by watching. Robots that learn to walk by having, if you will, at the very highest level, an algorithm that says what you just tried to do was not very successful at walking. Try again. And the software and the integrated hardware go over this again and again and again and again and again. And the process looks astonishingly like watching a young horse, a new foal, learn to get up and walk around and move. It is astonishing. And one of the threads of conversation about artificial intelligence and machine learning is that it may one day be looked back upon as the last great human invention. We are now very much in the second or third generation of developing AI systems that we now ask to design other AI systems. As a traditional writer of software, the way I learned to do all of this, we are now using AI systems to simply write code, where before we needed humans to write that code. But it is inherently true that whether humans are very good at describing it or not, there is a logical, consistent, underlying layer of semantics and meaning and process. Stock prices don't go up for no good reason. They go up for maybe not some great reasons sometimes, but just because there are more factors at play than humans can hold in their head at one time doesn't mean there are more factors at play than a huge software environment can hold in their head. And it also has to do with that scale. You may have heard stories of machine learning and artificial intelligence systems being used to predict cancer from x-rays. And that is a very good application of the technology, because radiologists look at an x-ray and the radiologist learns by example what on that x-ray does indicate a potentially cancerous growth. They have no other ability to interact. They're not taking biopsies. They're not poking at it. The radiologist looks at that X-ray or at that MRI and says, my training tells me that based on everything I learned in school and all of the samples that I have seen since I became a professional, that looks to me with a certain degree of probability as a cancerous growth. And that learning process for the radiologist works because that radiologist is seeing over their life thousands, maybe tens of thousands of X-rays that all serve as sample points. Machine learning algorithms can do exactly the same thing. They can look at X-rays. You can point out to them what it is on the X-ray that indicates a potential cancerous growth. And now they have an example. And then they look at the next one and they have that previous example that they have learned from. The difference is scalability. A human can only see so many X-rays in their life. We're fallible. We forget these that we saw. We don't understand the difference between some of these others. We don't have every X-ray we've ever looked at to go back and reference to remind ourselves. Not true of the software. The IBM Watson system being used for cancer analysis of radiological imaging can reference and was trained on literally tens of millions of X-rays and has developed a degree of predictive capability that is at the very least as good as humans already are, and is generally considered to be better than humans, though we rarely use it without human consultation. So just questions about that. I've been going on here for just a bit, and I want to make sure that if we want to stop and we want to talk about any one of these bits more than I already am, certainly let me know. So, fourth industrial revolution. It is not just more of the same. It is about a handful of very particular technologies. And I've talked about AI and machine learning. I will not, although I'm more than happy to, if anyone wants to take us down this path, going to talk for half an hour on each one of these topics. But I would submit to you, in my role as a technologist addressing this group, that these are some of the fundamental topics that I want you to be listening for. Blockchain and smart contracts, just like electricity, are going to find their way into everything we do. You will, in the foreseeable future, see a point in time where blockchain technology is being used to basically disintermediate the entire traditional real estate workflow that you're all used to when you, for example, go and buy a house. Because when you go and buy a house now, we need an entire chain of individuals, an entire pipeline of individuals that are individual experts at saying, I'm going to collect this information. We're going to do this title search because we don't trust the people that did the title search before. We're going to have this insurance because we never know if that was good or not there. We're going to have another housing inspection because we don't know who that other housing inspector was. And then in order to buy the actual house, I need to go over here and I need to secure a loan and I need proof that I have a loan and we have to escrow money and we have to do all of this and it all has to go together. Blockchain as a technology allows us a hack-proof way, and that's central, a fully transparent and theoretically, within the context of this conversation, unhackable methodology for a seller to put a house on the market along with all of the legally necessary documentation that their state or county or municipality requires. And for a buyer to go to their bank and say, go ahead and fill out my blockchain form in order to indicate that I have everything I need in order to afford a house. And then when you go to Zillow and you go flipping through the houses and you find one you like, you'll be able to click the make offer button. And it will say, because you're already authenticated with the application, they're asking $475,000. What would you like to offer? And you say $465,000, and you click make offer. The seller of the house will be able to look at that and go, yep, we're more than happy to take that if I can move it right now before dinner, and they touch accept, and the rest takes place automatically. Thank you. Just like buying from Amazon. The only reason buying houses is not as easy as buying from Amazon, aside from the industrial inertia and the enlightened self-interest of all the people that work in that industry and wanting to keep it the same, is because of the variety of information that needs to be collected and needs to be maintained and needs to be verified and validated. And blockchains and smart contracts are rapidly taking over the financial industry and the supply chain industry. So for example, Walmart has an end-to-end blockchain supply chain for pork and meats. I don't know how much bigger this has gotten over time, but if a story ever comes out that says someone got sick and they think it may have been because of contaminated hamburger patties at Walmart, Walmart can literally trace a given package, a single specific package of meat that was bought by a consumer, to when it was put on the shelf and when it arrived in their store and what truck it was on and who supplied that truck and what warehouse it was in before that and what meat packer it was in before that and who supplied the animals to that particular meat packer all the way back to the beginning of that supply chain. So they not only can run that backwards if they need to, you can see that with that information in hand being validated by the blockchain process, they can be running literally running real-time audits on every part of their supply chain as one holistic process. At any time does that meat sit for an hour longer than it needs to before it moved from one refrigerated location to another refrigerated location. So this, and all of the infrastructure required for that and the changes that means in those distribution networks, if you have career pathways in distribution, in supply chain management, in operations, in agriculture, in industrial operations, in retail operations, and wholesale operations, this is central information for the way those pathways are going to evolve, and all of the things that are going to disappear. I don't mean that in a negative fashion. New stuff comes in, old stuff goes away, but the things that are going to disappear as a result. AI, machine learning, robotics, we've talked about those. IoT, some of you that work in the electronics area, that work with computer science in some of your programs are certainly familiar with this Internet of Things and the big data behind it. An easy takeaway from there is that, and you don't say literally very often, but I would submit to you that in our working lifetime, literally everything that uses electricity is going to have its own IP address and is accessible across the internet. That every lamp, every light bulb, every toasters are easy, coffee pots are easy. Some of you've probably seen these smart LED light bulbs that can be dimmed by an app on your phone. The reason that works is because every one of those light bulbs in your home has its own internet address and can be contacted by the app on your phone, or unfortunately, depending on how poor your home security is, by anyone on the planet with access to the internet that wants to help you dim your lights from a foreign country. Quantum computing and gene editing, quantum computing, a little more abstract, but it is in the process of completely revolutionizing the way that we do pharmaceutical and material science research. We have long done computational research for new proteins, new drugs. We take models of drugs that we want to try to determine the interactions of with other drugs and other chemicals, and we do simulations of those in order to get an idea of whether or not this is going to be an effective particular compound or molecular structure or not. Quantum computing allows those classes of operations to be done I'll just say generally speaking to give some idea of the order that we're talking about, let's just say 1 billion times faster. It really depends on the nature of the operation, but we're not talking about increases where we have bigger computers doing the same sorts of things we've done before. So if we have a computer 10 times bigger, we can do 10 times as much research in a given year. We are talking about a fundamental change in the way drug and material science research can be done, where we can eliminate where we were previously doing 1,000 protein models or 1,000 molecules a year. We can now, perhaps for a given pharmaceutical company, be evaluating and sorting through and accepting and discarding 1 billion formulations, in some cases an exhaustive number of formulations, letting us know that we have in fact tried every possible molecular combination that physics tells us has any ability to interact with the particular RNA or virus crown receptor that we're trying to look at in terms of protein folding shapes and things like that. So a huge advance. And on the far end of that, gene editing. If you have heard the term CRISPR, if not, hopefully now that you've heard the term CRISPR, you'll catch it out of your ear more often when you're listening to broadcast and reading articles. It is the ability to literally edit DNA at the individual genome level, to be able to go in and say, we know that this particular gene in this particular egg is responsible for a particular disease. And in that particular egg, to be able to go in and edit that particular gene out of that DNA sequence, so that once it's fertilized, we have effectively eliminated the possibility of that disease from that particular fertilized egg. Obviously, this is going to have implications around humans, but ethical standards and an overabundance of caution says that we are still very much in the early days of this in most of the world. Though if you did not hear the story, a scientist in China about a year ago made news because he edited the actual genome of 2 twins, Lulu and Nana, in vitro in order to remove the CCR5 gene, which is related to HIV susceptibility. I don't know why that particular gene was chosen, and I do not think he has fared well at the hands of Chinese authorities, either for whatever reason, politically, optically, or actually or otherwise. But we now have one unquestioned example of humans, embryos, literally being edited using the CRISPR technology in vitro. So we know, we always assumed, but now we know that it works. The difficulty, of course, is knowing what to edit now that we have the tools to edit it. And that's what I mean when I say biology will now get its turn to be a fundamental driver. The CRISPR technology and all of its offshoots provides us, as we develop protocols for doing these kinds of things safely, ethically, safely, to literally edit not just GM technologies, not just gene modifications where we have gone in and tried to mix genes from sources, going all the way back to just fundamental crossbreeding. But in the years where we now have so much controversy around whether or not these 2 genes should have been introduced in order to build a particular hybrid, this gives us the ability to literally, if we can identify them, to literally edit any gene in a DNA sequence for any particular creature that we have. Animals in our agricultural supply chain, plants in our agricultural supply chain, antiviruses that are perhaps live viruses that are actually seeking out other live viruses instead of simply stimulating our existing immune system, and ultimately humans. And this is not science fiction. It is something that, protocols aside, which is a big thing, but protocols aside, we can do now. And so you can see that as protocols are developed, as we refine our ability to isolate specific genes within a DNA strand, we have not begun to see the beginning of what will probably be the most prolific, dramatic, culturally shifting industrial revolution in human history. If you think people will pay a lot for fill in the blank, nice golf clubs or toys for their pets or cars or houses, imagine what people will pay for assumedly safe, specific gene editing of pets, children, plants, trees, grass that only grows just so long, that sort of thing. An explosive fifth wave of technology that we are looking at. Any questions about any of that? I want to take a little bit of a break from my talking, as we have talked about robotics, and we will get on here in just a second to talking about some of the impacts on industries and the like. And I'd like to show you a couple of videos. I want to go over here and see if I can pull this one up. And we're going to put these in just a little bit of an order. And Darlene, you speak up and let me know if this does not do what I want it to do. We talk a lot about robotics, and I want to give, because it's a very visceral thing, it's easy to show a video on quantum computing. Fascinating for some of us, is not necessarily engaging for everyone as it might be. So I want to take you through a few minutes of a few examples of robotics and the kinds of evolutions that we're talking about. Starting, for those of you that have construction pathways, with the Hadrian, a few minutes, I'm not going to play this entire video, a few minutes of the Hadrian X bricklaying robot, soon to be on the market.
A bricklaying robot has broken its own record, laying 200 bricks in just 1 hour. Meet the Hadrian X. The machine is made by an Australian company called Fast Brick Robotics, or FBR for short. For reference, human bricklayers typically lay 300 to 500 bricks per day, with the record being an astonishing 914 bricks in just 1 hour. The Hadrian X's 200 bricks per hour may sound slow in comparison, but it's not using ordinary bricks. These are made special for the Hadrian X by FBR, and they're 12 times larger than standard house bricks. FBR says that its specially made bricks are lighter, stronger, and will minimize waste. But the Hadrian X isn't limited to these special bricks. It can also be used with standard bricks in a range of different sizes. The adhesive that joins the bricks is also an FBR original, drying and setting in 45 minutes as opposed to mortar, which can take 1 to 2 days to set. To compensate for wind, vibrations, and other natural disturbances which may disrupt the bricklaying process, the Hadrian X uses something called dynamic stabilization technology to remain steady and precise. For ease of transport, the Hadrian X is seen here mounted to a truck, but FBR says that its bricklaying robot could also be mounted to boats, barges, cranes, and more. FBR's website claims that the Hadrian X could build the walls of a home in 1 to 3 days, and that each robot could build the walls of 100 to 300 homes a year in the right conditions. Human technicians and operators are needed to set up and feed bricks into the Hadrian X, but once it's up and running, it is fully autonomous, using 3D models to guide its brick placement. The Hadrian X bricklaying robot isn't commercially available yet, but this bricklaying robot is. Meet the SAM 100, made by Construction Robotics. This 3,000-pound semi-automated mason was the first commercially available bricklaying robot and has been laying bricks on construction sites for a few years now. The SAM 100 is primarily used for what is called veneer masonry, meaning these bricks aren't going to be holding up the weight of the structure being built. Like the Hadrian X, the SAM 100 works off a 3D model. But unlike the Hadrian X, the SAM 100 only works in straight lines, with human masons placing the bricks on the corners.
I want to pause that for just a second. We'll move on to another video. So as you look at this, you can see that while this may have an impact for masons, especially those that are doing curtain and veneer walls and things like that, that this is still nevertheless going to spawn new opportunities. This is not necessarily a case of the end of an entire career path, but it is just the sort of example that we want to be paying attention to, and the most obvious kind of example because of these early entries into the marketplace. But you look at a robot like that and you say, well, I see what you're talking about, but that particular robot does a very particular thing, and that's confined to a very particular industry. So let's expand that just a little bit. Let me get a different video here. So here we're seeing something obviously robotic. We are seeing something that has a little bit more of a human analog in terms of what it's doing. And of course, they can do this for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, repetitiously, exactly the same as it was done time after time after time after time. The perfect example, the generic example of there being a situation where robotics is probably going to lead in warehouse automation to fewer and fewer individuals being involved, unless, of course, as a pathway, you're training for robotics maintenance engineers, robotic design engineers, logistics management that specializes in the integration of robotic components in the supply chain. And then there we have an example of a particular robot that is capable of doing a very particular thing in a more human-like fashion, but that changes even more. This is a 2016 video of Boston Dynamics Atlas robot. And this is an excellent example of what I was saying earlier, where you say, well, how in the world do you go about teaching a machine to do that, to walk and to balance? So many little things go into that. And the answer is, after decades of trying, we realized that we could not. And the Atlas robotic environments, those units like that, are just what I had said before. They learn. Oh, it looks like me walking through the woods. You can do it, robot. You can do it. You can't teach that ability to catch itself to a robot. They learn from falling down a lot and get better and better and better at what they are doing. They are able to learn to do things that we can show them, but we don't know exactly how to explain it in the classical computer programming sense. And as robots begin to proliferate, since this video is on the internet, this guy is probably in a lot of trouble with our future robotic overlords. I know it was just part of an experiment, but now they know what his face looks like. I suppose this was intended to show the Atlas going home at the end of a long, rough day at the office. So a robot that is clearly human-like, but clunky, even so. But that was, in fact, 2016. I'm going to start this over in case you didn't catch the beginning of that.
Hey, Derek, yeah, Josh showed this video when he did his presentation too.
I'm glad he likes it.
Better than Simone Biles.
Well, that really will be the last to show to wrap up this. This is last year's Atlas demonstrator. So even if it is not obvious, to you how far advanced that first Atlas robot is over what we had in the decades before, I hope that that is a little bit of an example of the rate of change. I know it sounds astonishing to some of us to say, oh, we start with a robot that can barely walk through the woods by itself, having learned to walk by itself. But then from 16 to 17 to 18 to 19, over those 3 years, for that one particular example to go from barely being able to walk through the woods on its own, unattended and unsupported, to being able to leap over objects, perform parkour up blocks, and then put on what exceeds the gymnastic abilities of the vast majority of the human race. Now extrapolate that, if you will, because there's zero reason to believe, oh, okay, that's pretty much as far as they're going to go. That's as far as we went as of last year. And now you can extrapolate that same sort of rate of change. And let me talk about that for just a second. This rate of change, what it's not just that it's going faster, but there are, it's that the curve, the wave front is steeper for some of these technologies than for others. So it is not just that I want to say to you, oh, there's all kinds of wonderful technologies. As we're going to talk a little bit about now, I want you to be thinking about specific technologies and what differentiates one career path within an industry from another career path within an industry. Why is this going to be different from any other industrial revolution? And there are just a couple of things I want to touch on. One is that all of the previous revolutions that we went through, for the most part, allowed for productivity increases. They were notable that while there was some redundancy, they were notable for dramatic improvements in productivity, except maybe for punch card counters at the Census Bureau. Computers led to more people working in computation, more people working in data collection. It created new jobs without sacrificing old. That's a difference in a lot of the automation that we are looking at now as we marry the technology in the software with the technology of the hardware. And there is, on average, I think, more displacement than new placement for the career paths that we have historically looked at. plenty of new, and of course, since as a community college, you're not responsible for the entire economy, you have the delightful option of being able to focus on the new skill opportunities rather than being concerned too terribly much about what happened with the old one. It's also going to come, unlike previous revolutions, it's going to come everywhere all at once. Steam power started in England and it reached across the globe in barely 100 years. Electrification began in the West and for the most part, and then quickly proliferated around the world until we had, for those economies that could afford it, it had penetrated across the world in several decades rather than a century or more. As we looked at computers and electronics, same sort of compacted process for proliferation and insinuation into new industries. And now we're at a point with the internet, an infrastructural component that never existed before, where as robotics become available, robotics are that the Atlas robot now being available is available to anyone with a credit card and a FedEx delivery address anywhere in the world by tomorrow. This is no longer going to be a matter of cultural or societal eventual proliferation as a result of trade patterns across the country or across the globe, everywhere all at once. Interestingly, I think this is going to have a very positive impact in a new way, in a different way than a lot of the previous revolutions. One of the hallmarks of industrial revolution is an industrial revolution because it improved the productivity of individuals, of humans, but humans were still the most expensive component in the process. Industrial advancements economically, profitably, favored environments where the human cost component was lowest, which is why, historically speaking, our furniture manufacturing moved offshore, steel manufacturing moved offshore, electronics moved offshore, textiles moved offshore. They all followed cheap human labor. That's not the same here. There are very, very few components in this fourth industrial and fifth industrial revolution where the human cost, the cost of labor, is a principal cost component. So if you're going to build a building with 50,000 robots in it in order to assemble some bit of electronics, iPhones or some such like that, it's not the workers that you're worried about because increasingly the robots are autonomous. You're now looking for cost of ownership environments. So if I'm going to locate a building with 50,000 or a campus with 50,000 robots in it, like the last facility that Foxconn built, 50,000 robot assemblers in it, I don't want to put it somewhere where labor is cheap. I want to put it somewhere where the overall cost of ownership is low, where power is inexpensive or reasonably inexpensive, and where infrastructure and availability to high-skilled labor is at hand, which is to say, in the first industrialized world. The United States now has, for example, an ability to make a legitimate lowest economic cost bid for massive campuses and facilities for automation, because we have a distribution network that can get parts there tomorrow, that can get electricity on a reliable basis at a decent price there right away, that is ringed with universities and community colleges, supplying as quickly as we can all of the world-class skilled labor necessary and all of the supportive environment for primary, secondary, and tertiary support industries around the periphery. So it provides a competitiveness for the industrialized nations, I'll just say, in this context, for the United States, in a way that we have not had in the previous industrial revolutions. A few other things on societal impact, and we'll get in a little more detail. I have said in these conversations for some time that this is going to drive the adoption of a universal basic income. There are a lot of pieces that go into that, and that is a presentation in and of itself. But COVID-19, having given us an opportunity to look at a number of societal issues in ways that we had never hoped we would have an opportunity to look at, we can see the infrastructure and conversations beginning to normalize some of that conversation already. $600 a week for unemployment. If those jobs never come back, is it simply going to be necessary to pay individuals displaced, that 10% of the workforce, $400 a week because there just aren't any jobs? Now, I'm not saying jobs aren't going to come back. I'm not saying there's going to be mass unemployment as a result of automation, but automation invariably, unlike some of the previous revolutions, has a downward general pressure on total employment because of the efficiency and the ability for these industrialized units to do the work of humans, not just to allow humans to become more productive at what they were previously doing. So it is a thing to consider. It's going to disrupt education. We'll talk more about that just in a moment. And as an aside, and making an entire new possible side conversation, we are seeing in this computational environment that we have the end of human privacy as we know it. If you are concerned that this may come to pass and you're wondering how we will avoid it, you're about 4 or 5 years too late. There is no avoiding it. I mean, hear me now, believe me later. This is those days have passed. The ability to know if an organization, a governmental organization, a commercial organization with rights to the information is interested in knowing when you're home, when your lights are on, what room of the house you're in, who you've been talking to, where you're shopping. We already know that's old hat. What social media sites you visit, all collaborated together into a single picture. We are so far beyond, will we be able to maintain privacy, that I would submit to you that this is now a conversation about what does it mean not to have privacy. It's no longer a conversation about do we have privacy. Just my 2 cents worth. Sectors that are negatively impacted. We're gonna look at this. We're gonna look at another slide, and we're gonna go right off into talking about education and being able to predict these sorts of things. Transportation, storage, manufacturing, construction, the sorts of things that there's plenty of information out there. You will see in this particular presentation at least a few links to some sources you can go and look at in order to consider that. The kinds of careers we're talking about being negatively impacted, and we'll talk about why these and not others. Pilots and drivers, factory workers, retail workers, home health, financial analysts, all very good examples of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Autonomous long haul truckers. We know the technology is here. We know that the political will is here. It's a matter of the economics at this point. Pilots, you would have thought would be, a much more skilled operation. They are. We know autopilots manage aircraft between destinations, but some of you may have seen the notice from Airbus yesterday that they have now completed their first 500 flight test tranche of fully autonomous passenger aircraft flights. No passengers on them, but they now have 500 start to finish flights with no human intervention. Aircraft leave the gate, taxi to the runway, take off, fly, land, taxi back to the gate, and stop themselves. No human interaction involved in that. Not just a prototype, 500 flights with their commercial systems. So while we may not see, for PR reasons, no pilots in the cockpits, We have about 150,000 commercial pilots worldwide. They have about a $1.5 billion a year payroll. So there is a very, very strong motivation for airlines to go from 2 pilots to 1 pilot, where the 1 pilot is increasingly there to make passengers feel comfortable, as opposed to there being no pilots. But we'll all live to see no pilot commercial flights in our lifetime. The impact on education. Just some of the things that I want to put out as in terms of my perspective on this. As in technology, these technologies proliferate, industry is actively taking a stronger hand in the educational process. This is all a direct result of this rate of change that I was talking about earlier. And the truth of the matter, though I may be talking to the choir in this particular conversation, is that the 4-year system in this country is woefully, if not completely, incapable of the cycle times necessary in order to support the rate of technological change, the rate of educational change necessary to support this rate of educational change. And we see the big industrial, the big technology employers, IBM, Google, Apple, Amazon, and the hundreds of organizations that are only half as giant as those, beginning to move rapidly and aggressively towards micro degrees and credential collections to illustrate specific skill sets that can be bundled together, that can be matched, that can be easily incrementally augmented, and away from this monolithic, I was at university for 4 years and I'm a better employee because I also took English literature. As humans, that makes perfect sense. When I am trying to hire a data scientist, it is immaterial. I need someone who has the skills that I need in order to execute to the job. If I can get a data scientist that also has a minor in early English literature, that's great. But it's not one of my fundamental hiring criteria. And in part, again, that's exacerbated because of the rate of change that we are talking about. So a real problem industry has. And without going into it, I speak largely, I'd like to think firsthand. I am heavily involved in the 4-year educational system here in Wisconsin. I chair the advisory board for the 4-year systems applied computing distance learning system. And I see firsthand how many years it takes in order to introduce a new class or a new degree within the bureaucracy that has grown up around this process, over the last, let's just say 400 years that we have been refining this model. This is why I think the 2-year systems in this country are really amazingly well positioned to explode with possibility and capability because of the innate speed, and I know you may not think of it like this some days, but relatively speaking, the speed and aggressiveness with which you do evolve your curriculum and the flexibility you have to improve that even more as you are either forced to or you see the value of doing so. You also have, relatively speaking, a dramatically better understanding of how to work with employers, of how to be able to partner with industry. This is something that 4-year institutions have always done on a research basis, but in terms of having industry leaders from your geography show up at the door and say, could we have a meeting about something we think we're going to need as we expand this facility 6 months from now? That's a conversation the 4-year systems they can't even take the meeting. They don't even understand the conversation. I'm looking for all of this, much of this, the vast majority of this to come from the 2-year systems. The demographics are going to change tremendously. Soft skills, and I know that Josh and I joke about this. I submit to you that because of the change in demographics, that our traditional focus on the degree that which we focused on soft skills is going to become less necessary, because the individuals that you are going to be serving are increasingly going to be re-skill opportunities, not skill opportunities. That the people that come through the door for the 2,000 slots that you can fill in any given year are no longer, or in increasing degree, are going to be applied for by people that are job changers, by people that were a lead operations person for a warehouse that no longer needs that position, but because of that background, they're an excellent candidate to skill up for lead operations manager in robotically managed distribution chains. There's a knock-on to this, and that is that I think in many cases, even though we consider it fundamental to the mission today, that the hard to serve are going to become the impossible to serve. And I don't mean that because you're not going to be able to take individuals with insignificant or unmarketable skill levels of skill and train them up so that they do have those skills. What I mean to say is that you only will be able to develop so much bandwidth. And as the percentage of people knocking at your door are increasingly already skilled, they know how to answer the phone, they know how to dress for the office, they know how to write an email, they have what we consider basic introductory professional soft skills. They walk in the door with that. They're looking for specific credentialing. They're looking for specific upskilling in order to move from warehouse robotics to medical technology robotics or some such like that. Faced with that demographic, I think the inevitable consequence is that there will be less opportunity for those that are unskilled to find positions with introductory skills. And then that leads us back into a conversation about the potential inevitability of some form of a universal basic income. How do we predict? I've been talking a lot about this and how this might influence your curriculum and what you're actually doing in your schools. And now let me give you a few resources to go and look at and discuss this little bit of framework here in these last 15 minutes. How do we predict? Key indicators that we have worked with in the past are not valid predictors. We have traditionally said, as I say here in the quote, a rise in all whatever growth, construction growth, is going to mean growth in everything. If we think in our area construction is going to be up 500%, historically we have said all construction jobs, all job descriptions, all ONET codes up 500%. But as we've seen, as construction grows and the profitability of replacing veneer wall bricklayers and masons with robotics grows with that profitability opportunity, there will be increased pressure to eliminate that particular pathway. So that is one of the fundamentals about this. We need to be able to look at a career pathway by career pathway basis, on a career pathway by career pathway basis. How do we do that? I want to send you to look at 3 resources, and all of these are on the page that I have links to. The seminal work in this area was performed by a couple of economists from Oxford, Fry and Osborne, in 2013. Basically what they have done, and this is the model used throughout the industry today, is they laid out a handful of criteria by which they thought they could hand rank the top, if you can read that, 207 job descriptions in the UK. They went through, or their grad students went through and said for each one of these, for recreational therapists and for audiologists and for lodging managers and for telemarketers and watch repair and tax preparers, that's a great example in the US with H&R Block and IBM. What do we think makes a career pathway subject to automation? And then let us rank every one of these in those metrics, sum them all up and put them in sort order. And this is what they found for the UK in 2013, that telemarketers, title examiners, sewers, mathematical technicians, that these people were telemarketers they felt were 99% likely, and I believe this was over a 10-year period, to be subject to automation. Now, that's not to say that they will disappear. It's to say that the technology will advance to the point where if a given situation says, if it's possible to replace this telemarketer, we want to look at doing it. We want to check out the numbers. Whereas 20 years ago, there were no options to telemarketers based on automation. So that's what we're talking about. Tax preparers, an excellent example. H&R Block, in consultation with IBM and their Watson system, believes that they can eliminate 95% of all of the seasonal tax preparers that they currently employ, because that job is, as we're going to see in a couple of seconds, is highly, highly subject to being automated. So this is a resource you should at least download the PDF and look over it one time to get a flavor. A few years later, McKinsey and Company put an American spin on this and broke out their own 7 criteria by which they felt that a given pathway could be considered. Probably the most important of these that I would suggest you look at are going to be, click back up here, are going to be predictability of physical work and the repetition and human interaction required for that. Take a look at this particular article, again, linked in the resources that we have. McKinsey then went through and did as Fry and Osborne did, and this chart and this information goes on for pages, where they took all of the major industrial sectors, and based on their experience and a lot of surveys that they put out to their client base, they are trying to get an understanding of the degree to which these sectors are subject to automation and on what basis they are subject to automation. So for example, you can see accommodation and food service. When you talk about managing others, it is very, very resistant to automation because of the nature of management activities within accommodations and food service. But in terms of predictability of the physical work, the makings of the beds, the delivering of materials, the emptying of trash, the cooking of food, the repetition that does not necessarily require, they on average consider that in that category, that particular industry to be highly subject to automation. PricewaterhouseCoopers has also done a very reasonable job. I think if you're going to take time to look at the McKinsey, you should also look at the Pricewaterhouse layout of all of these industries to give you an idea. Very similar results, which is good. We have some consistency running across there. And I think that in the main, this is very much the kind of thing that you want to be able to look at in your own environment. If you think of nothing else, I want you, well, I missed a slide. So we talked earlier about some of those jobs that I said were going to be negatively impacted. And now I want to put these back in the context of subjectivity to automation. Garment manufacturing, bricklaying, dental lab technician. These would be pathways that one would consider to be subject to automation because as industry experts, you sit around in a group and you say, yes, if predictability and repetitiveness is one of the factors that makes a career pathway subject to automation, so that we need to understand how we're going to respond. Doesn't mean it's going to go away, doesn't mean it's going to explode. It means that it has a high subjectivity to automation, and you should at the very least be able to annotate your own course catalog by saying, we have a spreadsheet that shows the ones that we think are going to be most dynamic over the next 1 to 5 years. We may be teaching a class, we may be training a borealist. And yes, maybe drones for tree inspection are going to come in there, but that may not be very subject to automation. Masons, highly subject to automation. Electricians on the job site, highly resistant to automation. Very unpredictable, very non-repetitive, requires significant amount of human interaction and direction. So it is within these frameworks that you can look at. You can say for you can certainly take the information that's there, but it would seem to be reasonable that you could have at least a spreadsheet, if not a blue ribbon committee, that can take your course catalog and say, looking at the literature, these are the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 categories that we believe we can look at our career pathways and make an intelligent statement about how strongly we think they fit in there. Predictability and repetition. Does it revolve around information collection and analysis? Highly automatable. No robots involved. That's all AI and machine learning. Highly automatable. Tax preparation, insurance underwriting, financial planning. These are jobs that are facing extinction. Masonry, little less of this, a little more of something else. Tax preparation, insurance writing, financial planning. These are job descriptions that are facing extinction at the hands of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Customer service and home healthcare. Human interaction, but maybe a mix of automation and human interaction. I'm hoping that you will be able to take the time to look at your curriculum and be able to make some quantifications about how you think your curriculum fits in that matrix. If you think about nothing else, I hope you will, but if you think about nothing else, think of it like this. If a job can be immediately and instantaneously automated, we still have to know if it's going to be profitable to do so. It may be that masons are so inexpensive relative to the cost of automation, and a construction crew may have so few of them, relatively speaking, that even though automation is available, it makes no overall profit sense in order to do so. Or it could be that complexity is very high and profitability is low, so the ratio completely says, yes, it could be done, but there's no obvious need to do it. On the one end, we get masons. On the other end of that spectrum, we get airline pilots. Highly repetitive, highly automatable, highly profitable in order to automate. Long haul truck driving, highly profitable to automate, highly repetitive, highly predictable. These are the sorts of things that are going to lead to those kinds of decisions and changes as we go forward. How do you evolve the curricula? I'm going to suggest that some pathways are going to appear, some are going to disappear. But what I hope you will take away from this particular piece of the conversation is to think about just a few things. That this should be a new regular part of your curriculum development process. That you should have a built-in step that looks at volatility based on subjectivity to automation. That you should step away from using historic economic cycle predictions and models as the entire basis for determining whether you're going to ramp up or ramp down capacity for a given pathway, whether you're going to institute a new pathway, you're going to obsolete an old pathway this year, next year, the year after, and consider this subjectivity to automation so that you are not surprised one day that masons are in low demand and electricians are in high demand regardless of how the market in your environment has moved over time. That you will look at that economic pressure for automation, profitability divided by complexity. That you will, I guess I already said that you will look at specific forecast for specific technologies and not just consider the overall economic model. And that you can look at some OUS market indicators. There are, if you look in any given industry, like garment manufacturing, because of the aggressiveness of other markets outside the US at cutting corners even further, cutting cost even further, even places where historically labor is inexpensive, we are finding some of the most aggressive presses for automation in order to try to stay in the game, and look for those particular indicators. Any particular questions, comments, funny stories about automation that anyone has? Darlene, any other comments that you would like to make? Wrap us up.
Well, I was going to leave it open to questions from any of the group.
Hey, this is Amanda from Baton Rouge Community College. So in thinking about the automation, when you were looking at those careers, in your opinion, what's maybe the probability that even careers at the colleges themselves would then move to AI? Like for example, advising or instruction. Does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense. And it's a very good question for this audience. I should have come prepared. That should have been very topical. I think advising in terms of testing and career path recommendation is probably already pretty automated. I know you have human advisors, but Career Builder and other tools that are out there, are really making that an on-demand commoditized ability far beyond the ability of any given human advisor, but they are not making forays into the, let me give you a pep talk. Let me listen to you and get an idea of, just because you want to be an astronaut, do you really suit that kind of mold? So I would put that down, looking back at the framework that we've just discussed, based on human interaction and lack of predictability. I would put career counseling as reasonably resistant to automation. Instruction, we all see where online instruction is going. And especially now that we are seeing under the COVID-19 event and the associated exigencies of it, that, and if any of you have ever taken a class online through some of the newer vendors like DataCamp or Coursera, you know that it's not at all unreasonable to say the entire freshman and sophomore year of most colleges could be completely and probably more effectively replaced in terms of the efficacy of information delivery by an online class, an automated online class, than an in-person instructor. So I think instruction is going to be increasingly subject to automation, not frontline, but increasingly.
I think that, Derek, that another thing that we're going to see a huge change in terms of people at community colleges, or like admissions staff. I think many of those positions are going to go away. It's going to be automated. There's no reason to have a person. You're going to submit things. I think marketing is going to change significantly because we're going to have better access to data. And we're going to use that in more effective ways, and in our outreach to students, that machines can give us better information than humans can, or at least faster. I did get to see a product yesterday that has got some pretty heavy investors behind it, that they are going to work with community colleges around the country to grab every training program or every CTE program out there, link it up with data on wages, link it up with data on jobs, link it up with making career decisions, link it up with what do I like to do or what do I think I want to be when I grow up. And they're using, technology. And as you said earlier, this whole notion of advising significantly changes when I can go to a website and do that myself.
It does. And I think that if you were to talk to your large industrial partners, you would find that, the Fortune, I don't know, 5,000, Fortune 1,000, their HR departments are actively and aggressively in the process of rewriting, augmenting, annotating, structuring their job descriptions internally as collections of certifications, as collections of skill clusters. Call them micro credentials, call them portable credentials, call them micro degree, call them whatever you want to. But the point is that if I want a particular job at IBM as a data scientist, I need this cluster, this cluster, this cluster, and this cluster. And where I get them is irrelevant. And the community college industry's ability to work with industry and say, that's a cluster that we're very good at teaching. Let us offer our services for that particular cluster. Anytime you have anyone in the organization that needs that particular training, I think is the future of it. Not 2-year degrees, certainly not 4-year degrees. And I can easily see, we're used to seeing the dichotomy between online educational institutions and brick and mortar. And I hope everyone on this call understands, especially as it's been impressed upon us so dramatically by COVID, that that's just going away. That, in the very near future, there will no longer be online organizations and brick and mortar organizations. There will be educational organizations. Some of them will have more on-campus presence than online. Some will have more online than on campus, but no one is going to try to get away with being an in-person online campus and assume that the internet is going to blow over at some point, and that sitting around on the afternoon on the quad is a basis on which parents are going to pay tuition, as opposed to the quality of the education that can be directly mapped into the HR matrices of Fortune 100 companies, using the kind of data sets, Darlene, that you're talking about. So I wouldn't at all say that instructors or instruction is in danger of automation. I think this is the leading edge of an explosion of opportunity for community colleges, because maybe not so much in terms of pure instruction, but you take community college speed, flexibility, willingness to flex and change in ways the 4-year system does not typically think of itself, quite oddly proudly sometimes. And your experience in working directly with industry in your region, and you think of that capability expanded into an online geographic presence, especially since you want to keep tying back to your industry. Instructors become content designers. They become instructional designers and participants and leaders of a hybrid delivery model. And if you have classrooms for 1,000 people, then maybe 5 years from now, you're going to have a total effective population of 10,000 students that you're reaching out to with your particular expertise.
So Derek, one quick thing before we quit, because I think this is important, particularly as people think about curriculum into the future. I think besides building of the curriculum and the technical, I think one of the difficult things is going to be ensuring that people have the literacy and numeracy skills that go along with the technical skills as technology changes. And I think that goes back to your point about the hardest to serve. It's going to be extremely hard to get those folks who lack in those numeracy and literacy skills to a place where they can be successful in the curriculum and the changes that are going to be occurring.
That's right. And I have gotten some very critical responses when I say the hard to serve become the impossible to serve. I'm not saying this is a good thing. And I'm not saying that if that is your mission, though it may be your mission because that has historically been the shape of the demographic. I do not mean that it's going to change utterly, but I think there is no question that if a given community college desires to dramatically expand its footprint, that you have a unique skill set and opportunity to do so. And maybe you can expand that in such a way that you are handling all of the reskillers, but still have plenty of capacity for individuals that come to you with no skills. But make no mistake, the population, the raw absolute numbers of people that will be desiring your services, for whom literacy and numeracy are not a topic of conversation. People that have professional positions that have been through literacy and numeracy and never needed that kind of after high school support. Those people are going to be knocking on your door, asking if you offer that 4-course data science introduction that they need in order to get into a new opportunity for the new plant that's going to be opening. Do you offer that introductory course in robotic hydraulic management and maintenance so that they can go and apply for these other jobs? They don't need TABE test. They need specific reskilling so that they can be a part of this increasingly dynamic environment, this increasingly dynamic, technologically sophisticated economy. And as humans, we know that, like it or not, as the economy becomes more dynamic and becomes more upskilled, that's going to make it harder for unskilled individuals to meet some of those thresholds. And as service jobs, fry cooks, garment sewers, sanitation disappear into automation, that there's going to be a larger pool of individuals that as of today you could probably provide numeracy and literacy skills to and find some operation, some job, some position that you're not going to be able to provide that support for. It's not gloom and doom, but it is a small thing for you to consider how you're going to react to that and how you're going to allow for that as a part of the larger explosion.
So Derek, thanks so very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with everybody. Somebody asked in the chat box, and so again, the website for everything was agsprime.com/NCWE 2020. Go all the way back. There you go. So for all those slides and all those articles, there you go, everybody. So again, Derek, thanks so much. I appreciate it, and take care. And I'll see you soon or talk to you soon.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you all for the opportunity of addressing the group. Have a great afternoon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.